Hello again. What I'd like to do is start by reviewing a little bit what we talked about last time, because that leads directly into what I'm going to discuss today. Remember we talked about Narmer and how Narmer was the first king of Egypt, and he united Egypt. Upper and Lower Egypt became one large nation, the first nation in history. Well, what I'd like to do today is show you the fruits of that, to show you just what you can do if you have a nation under one strong ruler. We're going to see the rise of the Old Kingdom. We're going to see Egypt really become great. And it's all going to happen because they had a king. Now, what we're going to see is first a capital, a city where the bureaucracy takes place, established. That's a sign of a nation. You know, villages up and down the Nile isn't the nation. But if you have a united group of people, they need a central place. And we will see a capital established at Memphis in the north of Egypt. We'll also see traditions that will last for 3,000 years. We'll see behavior patterns laid down for the pharaoh that future pharaohs will follow centuries later. And it all starts with Narmer, the first king of the first dynasty. Now, let me say some things about these kings of the first dynasty. Up until the 19th century, they were practically legendary. We didn't know anything about them. We had a couple of names, but no monuments, no evidence that they really existed. As far as we knew, they could have been mythological. Then excavations at a city in the south, Abydos, revealed that they had tombs. These are kings with names like Aha, Den, Zur, early kings. We know something about Aha. He founded the first capital city at Memphis. As a matter of fact, the word Egypt comes from Memphis. Originally, Memphis was called Hecapata. It was the place of the god Ptah. And when the Greeks came in, the first big city they hit was Memphis. Said, what's the name of this place? Hecapata. It became Egypta, which became Egypt. So Egypt really comes out of Memphis, the first capital. Now, the reason they established a capital at Memphis was for strategic reasons. It's in the north. It's about maybe 15 miles from Cairo, from modern Cairo. And Egypt was only worried about invasion from the sea. Egypt was really quite protected. Now, if you think about the geography, it's got desert on either side. Not easy to cross. To cross a desert, it would take a kind of organizational skill that no other nation had to get across a desert. You need water stations, you need supplies. So they weren't worried about their east and western borders yet. But maybe an invasion could come by the water, by the peoples on the other side of the Mediterranean. So if you establish your capital at Memphis, you've got a bit of a buffer, you can hear them coming, and then you can repulse them. So Memphis becomes the capital. But these first kings of the first dynasty aren't buried at Memphis. They're buried far away. They're buried at Abydos, this southern city. Now, why Abydos? The answer is, if you remember the myth of Isis and Osiris, where Osiris was hacked to pieces and then reassembled by Isis, his wife? Well, according to the myth, those pieces were put back together and buried at Abydos. So Abydos becomes the burial place of Osiris. It's the sacred city. Now, everybody wanted to be associated with Osiris. They wanted to resurrect just like Osiris. So if you could have a burial place near him, perhaps you too would resurrect. So the kings of the first dynasty are buried at Abydos. They have burials at Abydos. Now, let me describe these burials. They're not fancy affairs yet. Egypt hasn't learned how to do it really big time yet. They're basically pits in the sand. They're large. They're lined with mud bricks so the sand doesn't come in and fill it in immediately. They're mud brick pits, and in it the pharaohs were placed, along with grave goods undoubtedly. Now, they've all been robbed. All of them were robbed. These burials were excavated in the late 19th century by Sir Flinders Petrie. Now remember, Petrie was the one who figured out that pots can tell you what comes earlier and what comes later. And Petrie excavated at sites that nobody wanted, because as I said before, he wasn't looking for treasure. He was looking for knowledge. Well, Petrie excavated here, and he discovered the earliest burials of Egypt, right? The king's earliest burials. These little burials, they had in front of them a stela. You know, the large stone, round-topped. And on that stela was a serech. Remember the palace facade, that rectangle? Inside it would be the king's name, but standing on top of that stela was a falcon. The pharaoh was associated with Horus. Now this is the first name of the king, the Horus name. These mastabas, they yielded a few treasures, though. Petrie knew what he was doing. Let me tell you about the excavation techniques in those days. Petrie did something that no one else ever did. He paid his excavators for what they found. Every other excavator in Egypt simply thought it was their right. They're paying the workmen, the diggers, and they expected the diggers to bring everything that they found. But it didn't happen that way. It was often said in the 19th century of certain excavators, they only found large statues, never small objects. What that meant was the workmen were stealing the small objects to sell on the antiquities market. Petrie wanted to do away with this. So what Petrie did was, when anybody found a small object, perhaps gold, perhaps just a beautiful bracelet, he would look at the object and pay the workman the fair market value. So he knew that he got all of the small objects on his digs. Well, it paid off for Petrie at Abydos. He was away from the tomb while the workmen were excavating, and it was the tomb of the king Zur. And the workman came to him, and he said, "We found a mummy's arm." Found a mummy's arm, and on it is a gold bracelet. Now, Petrie's workmen had been trained not to move things. The arm was in a wall. It was somehow stuck in a wall. Probably what happened was robbers came, robbed the tomb. One robber finds this mummy of the arm, finds the arm with bracelets on it, doesn't want his fellow robbers to see that he's got something good, hides it in a wall, then leaves, but never returned to get it for some reason. So the workman came and said, "Professor Petrie, we've got a mummy's arm with gold bracelets on it." So Petrie had the arm brought to him. Now, it had two bracelets. One was a gold bracelet with serechs, those rectangles that represent the king, right, the palace, and on top of them, falcons, little gold falcons. This was a king's bracelet. This is the oldest royal jewelry we have, the arm of Zur. Now, I'll tell you what Petrie did. Petrie looked at it, and to establish the value, he took the gold bracelet and he weighed it against English gold sovereigns. And he gave the workmen the gold sovereigns. So he gave them the gold value. They were very happy, and Petrie had the oldest royal jewelry, which might otherwise have been stolen. Tell you what happened to the bracelet after, and the mummy's arm. The mummy's arm, which is the oldest relic of a pharaoh we have, was sent to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Now, this is in the 1890s, late 19th century. And the curator, Brier, of the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, looked at the jewelry, was very impressed, took off the jewelry, and threw away the arm. The oldest royal body, or part of a body that we have, was thrown away. Now, Petrie, in his later memoirs, said a wonderful thing when he was recounting this incident. When he talks about the curator throwing away the arm of King Zur, he says, "Sometimes a museum is a dangerous place." But that's what happened to King Zur. But these burials at Abydos are important because they established that these kings that we knew only in name before are real people. They lived, they walked the earth. Now, there's a bit of a mystery about these burials, and it's still disputed. There are two burials for these kings. There's a burial also in the north for these pharaohs. They have another burial at Saqqara. Now, Saqqara, the name Saqqara, comes from a god's name, Sokar, who was a god of the dead, one of the gods of the dead. Sokar became Saqqara, the place of Sokar. And Saqqara was used as an Old Kingdom burial, a burial in the early part of Egyptian history, for a long time. Now, why are these kings, why do they have tombs both at Saqqara and Abydos? Well, one is a false burial, what we call a cenotaph. And the reason to have two burials is that the pharaoh is really showing he is king of Upper and Lower Egypt, of the north and of the south, so he will have burials in both places. And what's debated today is we're not 100% sure for which pharaoh, which was the real burial. Was it at Saqqara or was it at Abydos? We're not sure. But they had two burials, and this will be a practice for pharaohs later on, as you'll see. So this is the first dynasty. The second dynasty lasts for 200 years, as long as America has been in business. But we know hardly anything about it, just a few names. But that gives you an idea of how remote this is in time for us. But the third dynasty, the one that comes next, is where it all happens. It's where Egypt becomes great, powerful, and does great things. And it starts with King Zoser, the builder of the first pyramid. Now, let me give you a little bit of tomb archaeology, a little bit of the history of the development of architecture. Now, remember from the lesson on prehistoric Egypt that they buried originally in sand pit burials, just simple burials? What happened frequently is that the sand would blow away, exposing the body. Animals would get at it, usually jackals, by the way. There's an interesting thing about the jackal and why jackals are associated with funerals and funerary rites. The jackal has an unusual digestive system. It prefers decayed meat, so it prowls cemeteries. That's why jackals are associated in ancient Egypt with the dead. But often jackals would get at these bodies from the sandpit burials, eat it, destroy it, and it became very clear that a sandpit burial was not permanent. Something better had to be done. Well, what did they do? They removed the sand down to bedrock when they were doing a burial. And they would cut in the rock a pit. And that's where they would bury, cover it over with stone, and then you had a permanent burial. Now, eventually, these rock-cut burials in the ground became elaborate, fancy. Someone got the idea, early on, that you could put a superstructure over it, a kind of rectangular enclosure made of mud bricks at first, and it could even have a room in it where somebody could go in and pay their respects to the dead. Now, this kind of burial, this rectangular above-ground burial, is called in Arabic a mastaba. Right? It's the Arabic word for bench because it's rectangular like a bench. Right? So these mastabas are the early burials, and the pharaohs in Saqqara have mastabas. Now, from the mastaba, it's just a short jump to the pyramid, and let me explain why. The king who really is given credit for starting with the first pyramid is King Zoser, third dynasty. And we know the name of his architect, who probably really is the one who should get the credit, Imhotep. The reason we know his name is a statue base, just the base of a statue, a couple of feet, you just see the feet, it's broken off, but there's an inscription around the base, and it talks about Imhotep, and it gives his titles. And Imhotep was the royal architect of Zoser. So he is probably the one who had the idea for the first pyramid in history. Now, what he did was this. He was just building a big mastaba for Zoser. That's all he was doing. They were planning a mastaba, a large one, big as a football field. Then he had the idea, let's make it special. Let's put another mastaba on top of it. So you'd have a mastaba with a second mastaba, a little smaller though, so you have like a step effect. And then they decided to make it even bigger. So they enlarged the base, made another mastaba on top of that one. You have 3 mastabas, and they kept going till you get 5 layers on top, the step pyramid of Saqqara. It is the first pyramid that we have. It's not a true pyramid, that's why we call it the stepped pyramid. But there are some remarkable features about this pyramid. First, what I find most amazing, it's the first building in stone in the history of the world. Now, to me, it would seem as if you would start with small things. You'd have lots of small buildings around, learn how to work stone, then you go to something bigger, and you'd see transitions. But no, this is the first building in stone in the history of the world, and it's grand. It was probably 3 or 4 times taller than any other building on the planet. It must have been incredible to watch it being built. If you were a kid in Saqqara, watching the pharaoh's tomb being built, it must have been amazing. Now, it wasn't just the pyramid that he built, though. There's an entire complex that goes with it. Zoser also had, next to his pyramid, a little room, which is called a serdab. It's a technical architectural term in Egypt. A serdab is a little room where he included a statue of himself, life-size. And the serdab is neat. It's like a telephone booth, practically, that size, made out of stone. It has 2 holes drilled in it, so Zoser's statue can look out for eternity. Now, this statue has a purpose. in case Zoser's body was destroyed for some reason, perhaps by tomb robbers, perhaps by the elements, water table, whatever, if his body were destroyed, this statue would be where his soul would know it could live till it resurrected. So it would take the place of Zoser's mummy. Right? Now, in addition to this serdab, as we call it, Zoser also built chapels in stone all around the pyramid complex, all these little chapels. Now, these were for religious ceremonies. For eternity, though. Remember, this is the first building in stone. Nothing like it's ever been done. And let me say this about the architecture. They didn't know how to build in stone, really. They were doing amazing things. For example, they were imitating what they were used to building in wood and in straw and in papyrus. They were imitating it in stone. So, for example, where they had wooden doors that would swing open, well, they would build a door out of stone that looked like a wooden door, but it couldn't swing. It was too heavy, too big. It was just decorative. It was a false door. But they were just imitating what they were used to building. Even the columns in the complex. There's a hall where you enter the complex, which has columns. But those columns, if you look at them carefully, they look like they're fluted. They have lines going down them. What they imitate are bundles of papyrus tied together. That's how they built columns before stone buildings. Simply long stalks looking like sugar cane, bundled together, and that was a pillar. So they built it out of stone. So everything looks like it's made out of wood, made out of papyrus, but it's just imitated in stone. Now, in addition, Zoser was going to celebrate a festival for eternity. It's called the Hebsed Festival. It's one of those things that we've been puzzling about in Egyptology for many years, how it started. Let me give you a kind of tradition. The pharaoh was the physical ruler of Egypt. He wasn't just like the Queen of England, a figurehead, a political ruler. He was literally the one who had to ride out in battle. He was the one who had to lead the army. He was the one who had to do it all. What happens if the pharaoh becomes old and feeble? What do you do? Well, there's a tradition, people talk about it, that in the very early days, the pharaoh was killed. Ritually. Literally, but ritually, as a ritual, when he got too old, so that a new king could take his place. We don't have a lot of evidence for that, but we talk about it. But then came a ritual that we know for sure happened. At some point, a pharaoh would say, well, I might be getting old, but I can have a religious ceremony which will magically rejuvenate me. This is called the Hebsed Festival. It's a festival in which the pharaoh would run a race course, a short one, I'm sure. He would wrestle with younger men. He would shoot arrows to show that he was still accurate, could still see things well. And after that festival, he would be rejuvenated by magic. He would be young again. Much better than being killed. And this festival was celebrated every 30 years. So after a pharaoh had ruled for 30 years, he would celebrate his Hebsed festival. Now Zoser built a Hebsed courtyard. It was an area where he would celebrate his festival for eternity. So when he got to the next world, every 30 years, he could continue to be rejuvenated. Now the Step Pyramid is an amazing, amazing monument, and it's probably due to the architect Imhotep. Now the search for Imhotep's tomb is one of the great stories of all time. Walter B. Emery, an Egyptologist in the 1950s, decided to look for Imhotep's tomb. And he had an idea. Zoser was buried at Saqqara. Probably, as a thank you to his architect, Zoser would permit Imhotep to be buried near him. So it was believed that the tomb of Imhotep was at Saqqara. But where? Well, Imhotep had a tremendous reputation. He was not only an architect, he was a physician. And he later became deified as a god. And even the Greek god Aesculapius is really related to Imhotep. The Greek god of healing and medicine, Aesculapius, really comes from the Egyptian Imhotep. Now, Emery knew that people had made pilgrimage to Saqqara. He saw lots of pots on the surface. Pilgrims tend to drop pots and break them along routes. But we knew that people came to Saqqara for healing. It was like a Lourdes of the ancient world. And he believed they were making a pilgrimage to the tomb of Imhotep. So Emery started excavating where he thought was a likely site, where he saw these pots, and he dug down and he hit a tunnel looking very much in size like a subway. Now that tunnel was filled with mummified birds, ibises, more than 1 million. These were offerings that pilgrims had brought to Imhotep. Now, when Imhotep became a god, the bird that was associated with him was an ibis. So Emery knew he was on the trail of Imhotep's tomb. So he started following these millions of ibises through the tunnels, had difficulties. Sometimes the roof would cave in, he'd have to shore it up. And for years, Emery excavated at Saqqara, looking for the tomb of Imhotep. Eventually, he even found inscriptions to Imhotep saying, please heal me. You would bring an ibis, give it to a priest, say a prayer for me, give it to Imhotep, and let my leg be healed. So Emery found this trail and followed it for years. But then he died. Never found the tomb of Imhotep, and it's never been found. No one has picked up the excavation. No one has followed it through, and it could be that he was on the trail, that perhaps the architect of the first pyramid in history is waiting there to be discovered soon. But that's the step pyramid of Zoser and his architect, Imhotep. Now, remember the kings of the first dynasty had these dual burials at Abydos and at Saqqara? Zoser had 2 burials. He had the step pyramid, but he had what was also called the southern burial. Just a couple of 100 yards away, south of the step pyramid, is another burial called the southern burial. It's a mastaba-like burial, not a pyramid. Rather beautiful, by the way. I've been in it. It's a little bit dangerous to go in. It's locked, but it's rather beautiful. It's underground. You go down, and in the burial chamber are beautiful green tiles. It's almost like bathroom tiles. They're lining the wall, and they show Zoser running the Hebsed festival. He is celebrating his jubilee, his 30th jubilee, being rejuvenated forever. These tiles are made of faience. Faience is a kind of ceramic that was an invention in Egypt. It's a fantastic. It's called faience, by the way, because of an Italian town, Faenza, that makes similar things nowadays in modern times. But it's a ceramic, like it's a quartzite paste, and when you fire it, when you heat it in a kiln, whatever impurity is inside the paste comes to the surface and glazes it. So, for example, if you put a little malachite in certain, you can make it green. If you put a little blue turquoise, you can make it blue. You can control the color by putting the impurity in the quartzite paste and firing it. So it's a self-glazing ceramic, rather beautiful. And Zoser's southern burial is covered with these tiles, rather elegant. And this is the very first pyramid subsidiary burial. You have a pyramid and a second burial. Now, Zoser starts the pyramid tradition, and it's continued by his successor. And his successor's pyramid is one of the funniest stories in archaeology. It's called, well, his name is Horus Sechemchet. Now, the Pharaoh Horus Sechemchet was going to build a step pyramid just like Zoser's. But he died before it was finished. It was only a couple of meters high. But it was discovered as late as 1951. The pyramid was discovered. And what was great about it was, sure, it was unfinished. It only went a few meters high. But 2 things were wonderful about it. One is, because it was unfinished, we could tell something about how pyramids were built. See, always, I feel that an unfinished monument is more interesting than a completed one, because you can see how they were doing it. You can see where they left off. And what surprises me is the walls of the pyramid, made out of stone, but the walls are still rough. They haven't been finished at the quarry. They were going to be finished in sight. You build up the wall and it's kind of rough surface, and then a workman would come in and chisel away and make it finished. I would have thought they would finish all the blocks to a uniform standard and then ship them to the site, because then you don't have to ship so much stone. What you have is a lighter block. But no, they shipped rough blocks to the site, put them in place, and then finished them on the site. But the amazing thing about this pyramid is it was found intact. He died before it was finished. But when the excavators found it, the burial chamber was sealed. This was, they hoped, going to be another Tutankhamun's tomb. A pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty, his pyramid found unrobbed. So, what do you do? Well, they started excavating. They opened there's a corridor leading down to the burial chamber. And on the floor, they found gold bracelets, gold beads, a magical wand, interesting items. And then they came to the burial chamber, which was still sealed. Still sealed. So this was, indeed, a pyramid that had not been robbed. Now, I know everybody's wondering, well, how come I haven't heard about this? How come I haven't heard about this? Well, there's a reason. There's a reason. Because this is after Tutankhamun's tomb, 1950s by the time they're going to open it, everybody was hoping for the greatest treasures ever. So they worked very carefully. And at the opening of the burial chamber, all the dignitaries in Egypt were called in, all the newsmen were called in, and there was a great opening. And they opened the burial chamber. And there, in the middle of the burial chamber, was a sarcophagus, a stone sarcophagus, still sealed. Now let me say something about a sarcophagus, what a sarcophagus is. It's different from a coffin. It's stone. A coffin is usually made out of wood. And the reason sarcophagi are always stone, the word comes from the Greek. When the Greeks first came into Egypt and opened some of these stone sarcophagi, they looked inside, and what they found were badly preserved mummies. Basically skeletons. And they looked at the skeletons that were inside these stone sarcophagi, and they called them flesh eaters. Sarcophagi, as in esophagus, a sarcophagus, they're flesh eaters. That's what sarcophagi means, flesh eater. So they call these stone sarcophagi flesh eaters. So when they opened this burial chamber, there was the sarcophagus, still sealed, intact. On top of it was some burnt plants, probably a funerary wreath that had been burned as an offering. Everybody was waiting to see the body of Horus Sechemchet. The lid was difficult to, it was really a tense situation. The lid was very difficult to lift. It was not a lid that came off the top of the sarcophagus. It was a lid on the side of the sarcophagus that had to be lifted up by pulleys. Very difficult operation, but they finally lifted it off. Nobody was home. There was no Horus Sechemchet in it. It was empty. Now, why would a pharaoh build a pyramid, put gold jewelry in the corridor on the floor, have a sarcophagus placed in a burial chamber, sealed, even a funerary wreath on it, and not be buried in it? What was going on? Well, there are a couple of theories. One possibility, of course, is that he's following in the footsteps of Zoser and the kings of the first dynasty, and he was going to have two burials. And this is the cenotaph, the false burial. But it's pretty elaborate for a false burial. The other theory is that it was intended to throw off tomb robbers. That Horus Sechemchet was afraid that robbers would one day see his pyramid, crash in, and take whatever he was buried with, and his mummy also. So what he did was he created this as a decoy to fool the robbers, to throw them off the track. But it didn't work. And I'll tell you why it didn't work. Usually, the tomb robbers were the men who built the tombs. They knew the ins and outs of tombs, and they would know what was placed inside the tomb. The workers, if you were working on Horus Sechemchet's pyramid, you would know that, oh, the pharaoh's not in there, we're doing this as a dummy. Whoever seals that knows nothing's in there. They've never seen the pharaoh's body brought in. They knew that it was a dummy, and they left it alone. The interesting thing, though, is we still don't know where Horus Sechemchet was buried. He must have another tomb. If this was the decoy, if this is the one to throw off the tomb robbers, there's another burial somewhere, but we haven't found that one yet. But what we've seen in this beginning of what we call the Old Kingdom is Egypt rise to greatness, where a pharaoh named Zoser can build the greatest building on the planet, the Step Pyramid of Saqqara. And this is a tradition that will be continued, and we'll talk about that next time. See you next time.